Hi, this is Arena of Revenge. Here you'll find exciting stories with gripping plots and vengeance. Follow us.
I always believed that I knew the people around me, especially those who had been with me through 20 years of life, and the one with whom I started a business when we didn't even have money to rent an office. Back then, we rented an abandoned space on the outskirts of San Diego and worked 12 hours a day just to break even. Then everything started to improve. I focused on investments, he handled negotiations, and my wife, as I thought, simply supported both of us, trying to keep the house in order and be a support when everything around us was shaking. At some point, I even felt that I had won some kind of inner lottery: family, business, friends, confidence in the future. But confidence turned out to be the most expensive illusion. It all began with ordinary little things. She started coming home late, explaining it with meetings with friends or trips to her mother. He also often stayed late at the office, as if deliberately looking for a reason not to leave after meetings. I didn't pay much attention. With age, the habit of trusting by inertia appears. Then the first signs came, but I was too busy to notice them. Our lawyer once called and asked why I hadn't signed a document for a deal, even though the signature was there. I thought it was a mistake and didn't delve into it. The signature looked like mine, but in the corner there was another date, not matching the day I was actually in the city. I attributed it to the secretary's carelessness, but then it turned out that the document had gone into the tax report, and already from my side. This became the first stone in what later collapsed. I didn't understand that in parallel a new scheme was being formed, where I was merely a signature on other people's decisions. A few months later, strange conversations began at home. She increasingly mentioned that I spent too much time at work, that I no longer looked at her the way I used to, that business had become more important than family. I tried to explain that it was all for stability, for the future, but in her gaze there was a void, as if my words passed by unnoticed. At that time I still didn't know that she already had her own plan, quiet, calculated, thought out to the last detail. One evening coming home I caught her at the laptop. Financial spreadsheets familiar to me appeared on the screen. When I approached, she closed the lid and said something like, "Don't interfere, I'm checking your reports, I want to understand where the money is going." I smirked then, thinking she was just jealous of work. Now I understand, she was checking how my handwriting looked on contracts. Then there was a conversation with my friend. We sat in a bar by the ocean, drinking whiskey, and he said that we should think about restructuring assets so as not to depend on taxes. He was always rational, but that evening his insistence seemed strange. He mentioned her name casually, as if by accident, but his voice trembled. Then I first felt an unpleasant chill under my ribs, as if someone had run a blade along the inside of my chest. I remained silent but remembered every word he said. A month later, a notification of an audit arrived. Legally, everything looked clean, but the lawyer reported that the submitted package included a statement about my financial violations with my wife's signature as a witness. In the initiator field, my partner, I reread that sheet, unable to believe my eyes. It seemed like a mistake, an unfortunate joke, but the handwriting, the phrasing, everything matched. Then I first felt that peculiar silence when even the air seems to betray. I didn't call anyone, I just sat in the kitchen, listening to the refrigerator hum. Outside, the city went about its life, cars passed by, a dog barked somewhere, but in my head a ringing emptiness settled. The next day I arrived at the office and realized that my key card didn't work. The secretary avoided eye contact. The accountant quickly gathered papers as if she knew it was the end. My partner came out to me, smiled politely, and said that everything was being handled at the lawyer's level. His tone was cold, like a court notice. Then he added that it's better to settle everything calmly since the court was just a formality. When I returned home, suitcases were by the door. She was sitting on the couch, documents next to her. I didn't immediately realize it was a property division lawsuit. The amount looked like a cruel joke, $2.8 million, half of what we had earned and built over the years. Half of the house, half of the company, half of life. She said something about rights, about justice, about her share, as if it were the words of a lawyer, not the woman I had lived with for 15 years. I didn't argue. At that moment, arguing was pointless. I just watched her put the documents back into the folder, checking her phone, waiting for a call from someone. I already knew from whom. A week later, the hearings began. The judge read the documents. My former friend gave testimony, speaking confidently, calmly, as if he had rehearsed every phrase. She sat next to him, her gaze direct, cold, like someone who had already made all the decisions. Every argument I tried to make sounded helpless. Their strategy was perfect. At the right moment, written evidence appeared, signatures, dates, even internal reports I hadn't known about. I realized that this had been prepared for months, possibly years. When the court announced the decision, it felt like the hall had collapsed. Everything I had built was now on the other side of the table. Half legally hers, the rest in limbo under audit review. I felt neither anger nor pain, only a strange relief, as if a blindfold had finally been removed and now I could see everything without illusions. After the hearing, he approached, offering his hand as if between us it were just a business dispute. I didn't respond. At that moment, I realized that betrayal is not a moment, not an event, but a process. It grows slowly in silence between words, in the little things we do not notice. When it was all over, I went outside. The air was thick, smelling of salt and gasoline. I walked across the parking lot, listening to my footsteps, thinking of only one thing, the moment when I stopped distinguishing the line between trust and naivety. After the court there came silence, the kind that has no sound. The house felt foreign, even the walls seemed to have changed color. Every object that once had meaning became a reminder. Her things were hanging in the closet, but I didn't touch them, not out of sentimentality, but because any movement gave birth to pain, as if those fabrics could answer with a look. The phone stayed silent, partners no longer called, clients disappeared, as if I had been crossed out from the list of the living. In the first days I tried to hold on, busied myself with small things, cleaned the garage, checked the mail, counted what was left in the accounts. Everything looked proper on paper, but inside it was as if nothing remained. I stopped feeling time, could not tell where morning was, where evening. In the refrigerator stood unfinished bottles left after the last dinner with her and with him. I remembered that evening down to the smallest details, the laughter, the discussion of future plans, the lightness that now seems like a stage set before an execution. A week after the court came a letter from the bank, a notice of share transfers. Everything formalized, official, without the possibility of appeal. I signed the electronic confirmation without reading the lines, then sat for a long time before the monitor, looking at the reflection in the black screen, and did not recognize myself, the face of a tired person who has nothing left to protect. In the evening I drove to the old office. The security let me through out of habit, but inside everything was already different. On the door of my office was a new sign, another name. The furniture stood the same, but the smell had changed, no longer coffee and paper, only the cold air of the conditioner. In the corner someone had left a box with my folders, neatly arranged like at a funeral. I took the box without saying a word. In the car I sat for a long time without starting the engine. On the passenger seat lay an envelope, a notice of a tax recalculation. The court had not only divided the property, but had also obliged me to pay part of the debts they had taken out on the company after my departure. Then I understood that I had lost not just the case, but my own identity. Everything I had been was now listed under their names. A few days later I learned from a former employee that they had opened a new company. The name almost the same, only adding the word group. On the site were the same projects, my own ideas, even the descriptions of strategies I had written myself. In the About Us section hung a photo where she and he stood together, smiling, and below it the caption, "Founders and inspirers of a business built on trust and family." I could not finish reading. For the first time in many weeks I felt physical pain, as if someone squeezed my chest from the inside. Then came emptiness, no anger, no jealousy, only endless fatigue. I turned off the computer and sat for a long time in the dark, listening to the rain outside the window. Sometimes it seemed to me that I saw their shadows in the windows of the neighboring house, but perhaps they were just reflections of streetlights. I began waking up in the middle of the night, not understanding where I was. Dreams became short, torn, as if memory were trying to erase what could not fit into consciousness. In the morning I would go outside, watch people going to work, smiling, talking on the phone, and could not believe that someone still had a purpose. I no longer sought meaning, only movement. At some point I sold the car, rented a small apartment on the outskirts to disappear from the places where everything reminded me of the past. The neighbors did not know who I was, and for the first time in a long time it was a relief. I started walking, going into cheap cafes, listening to strangers' conversations, as if through them I was trying to feel life again. Sometimes I caught myself envying those who argued over trifles, at least they had something to argue for. Everything around became like a background, and I, like a shadow, accidentally caught in the frame. Letters from lawyers no longer came, the cases were closed, the process ended. Only once did a man from accounting call and offer to meet. We sat in an abandoned park. He told me that after my departure they had transferred part of the assets to a new legal entity, formally without breaking the law. I listened and understood that the fight was over because against cynical logic no truth exists. Returning home, I opened an old laptop and found an archive of correspondence where the three of us discussed the first deals. I read and felt how between the lines even then lived the seeds of their union, exchanges of glances, too frequent joint ideas. I just didn't see it at the time. The strangest thing was not the pain, but the indifference that came afterward. It wraps like a blanket under which memories quietly rot. One day I accidentally saw their interview in a business magazine. She spoke about partnership, about trust, about the importance of honesty in business. He sat next to her, looking at her with the same expression with which he once looked at me when we celebrated our first success. I turned off the sound, and for a long time just watched their lips moving in unison, as if rehearsed. I did not feel hatred, only a cold understanding that they no longer belonged to my world. After that, I stopped following them. I understood that revenge is meaningless when the opponent already lives in another reality where you do not exist. With each day I felt how memory erased details. My wife's voice grew quieter, my friend's face blurred in my mind. And yet sometimes, when in the evenings the light went out and the city froze, the same feeling rose inside, as if I were standing at an edge, and beyond it there was nothing. No fear, no hope, only emptiness that requires no explanations. The room smelled of dust and old papers. I sat at the table, laying out all the old contracts, emails and financial reports before me. It all seemed to no longer matter, yet I noticed details the lawyers and the court had missed. I examined each document with cold attention, unhurried, as if studying a chessboard before the decisive move. My hands no longer trembled as they had when opening letters from the bank or notices of share transfers. Now there was only concentration, quiet, almost mechanical. I remembered that a few months earlier he had advised arranging the papers in such a way that I would supposedly lose control. Back then, it seemed to me like concern for order, a professional approach. Now I saw how each of their steps had been calculated, like a chain leading to my fall. I began compiling a list of all the transactions that could be disputed, studied filing deadlines, checked signatures, dates, compliance with laws and regulations. It required time and patience, but for the first time in many weeks I felt that I controlled something, even if only partially. The next step was people. I called several former employees I trusted, who had left earlier after sensing tension between me and the partners. Their initial reactions were cautious, but when I explained the situation, interest appeared. They knew details that had not made it into the court file and could corroborate my version of events. I realized I was assembling a team for a quiet but precise counterattack. Nothing loud, no emotions, only facts, documents, witnesses. Time worked in my favor. I discovered that several deals executed after my departure contained formal errors, dates, signatures, inaccuracies in contracts with counterparties. I created a spreadsheet marking each element that could be used to challenge the allocation of assets. Not in a public scandal, but through legal and financial scrutiny, carefully and methodically. Each step gave the sense of control that had been missing for so long. At the same time I watched their new project. The company was growing, but in its growth there were signs of haste and overconfidence. They used my ideas but did not care about the details I had always checked. That gave me a chance, not revenge in anger but strategy. I began to draw up a plan, how to lawfully reclaim at least part of what belonged to me, how to restore justice without unnecessary noise. Every day I reviewed correspondences, studied financial reports, noted patterns in the behavior of my ex-wife and partner. The slightest mistake, a misstep that was an opportunity. I understood that revenge should not be emotional. It had to be precise, calculated, almost invisible to others. In the evenings I sat by the window, watching the street, noting how people passed, which shop signs had changed, where witnesses or documents might be found. Each element fit into a single strategy. Sometimes it felt as if I were turning into a shadow, watching the world that had once been mine. That gave a strange satisfaction, cold and quiet. I no longer tried to recall the past, did not wait for apologies, and did not seek justice from them. The whole focus was on what I could do here and now, how to regain control. I studied legal resources, read laws, reviewed old court cases, searched for precedents, everything assembled into a step-by-step scheme. Evidence, witnesses, formal errors, financial transactions, documents, witnesses from the past. Each day added new details, assembling the puzzle. I began to feel stronger than I had in many months. The silence of the room, long hours over documents, the cold light of the lamp, all of it created a concentration like that before a great test. Inside me there was no room for fear or pity, only precision and calculation. I understood that the first results would not appear immediately, but every small step increased the chances of success. There arose the feeling that now I was acting again, not merely observing. Control returned through attention to detail, through knowledge of processes, through the slow but certain accumulation of strength. Sometimes I stopped, looked at old photographs at moments with my wife and the friend, but now they did not bring tears or fury, only a cold understanding that their victory had been temporary and my strategy was consistent. I did not hurry, did not rush events, did not wait for drama. Every step was calibrated, every detail mattered. Thus began my quiet preparation, the first stage of the counterattack, where emotions stayed outside and a force was born within that in time should return to me at least part of what had been taken. The morning began quietly, but I already felt that there was movement within this silence. On the table lay the documents I had checked the day before: contracts, accounting reports, bank statements. Every little detail now mattered, and I carefully noted even the smallest mistakes, dates, signatures, wording that could give me an advantage. I did not rush, simply going through the papers one by one, feeling a sense of control returning with each opened document. My ex-wife and the friend still did not know that I was taking action. Their new business contained many oversights, and I used this to my advantage, discreetly informing counterparties of potential inaccuracies, creating quiet but perceptible tremors. I could see their confidence beginning to crack, even though outwardly they continued to smile in photographs and interviews. I gathered several witnesses from former employees and colleagues who could confirm my data on incorrectly prepared documents and falsifications made after my departure. Their words were measured, cautious, but precise, and for me, it was confirmation that the strategy was working. I filed a claim structured as a chain of small but significant violations, so that the court would consider them individually, not the entire sum at once. It was slow and required patience, but every document was perfectly prepared. The first hearing passed calmly without loud statements. The judge examined the materials carefully, and I watched the expressions on my ex-wife's and partner's faces change. They clearly did not expect me to build the case so thoroughly and convincingly. When the judge made the first remarks about shortcomings in their documents, a strange feeling arose within me, not joy, not anger, but cold satisfaction. It was a sign that the strategy was working. The following week we received a preliminary order. Part of the disputed assets was frozen until the conclusion of the proceedings. It was not a complete victory, but it was tangible. The money, at least partially, returned under my control, which meant that all the efforts were not in vain. I began recording every result, noting which steps worked and planning the next ones. Every evening I checked their business, observing how failures occurred, how employees hesitated, and it provided additional confirmation of the effectiveness of my tactics. Sometimes my ex-wife tried to act actively: calls, letters, attempts to influence judges or counterparties, but they met my preparedness. I could already anticipate their steps, and every attempt to knock me off course only confirmed that they no longer held the initiative. Time was working in my favor. I felt concentration returning, and each day it became clear that even small victories brought closer the moment when part of what was lost could be recovered. I did not allow myself emotions, no shouting, tears, or hysteria. Only cold precision, every step measured and calculated. Sometimes I sat at the old laptop and reviewed correspondence with my former partners, remembering moments when they considered me blind, naive. Now I saw everything like a chess player. Every move of theirs could be predicted, every weak point exploited. One evening my lawyer called and informed me that one of the deals had been declared invalid, and part of the funds had been returned to my account. I sat in the dark apartment, listening to the rain outside the window, and for the first time in a long while felt satisfaction, but without exhilaration. It was cold, calculated joy. I understood that many steps still lay ahead, but the main thing was that the strategy worked, and each day brought small but tangible results. I began mapping out further actions, noting weaknesses in their new business, legal loopholes, potential witnesses, and documents that could still be used. Each day was like preparation for a quiet but precise attack, where no emotions interfered, only enhanced attention to detail. I saw their confidence beginning to waver, though they still did not understand what had caused the first disruptions. This was my small victory, not a public triumphant scene, but a cold yet tangible result, giving me hope and confirming that the long and methodical path would lead to the goal. At night I sometimes went outside, observing the city, people, the movement of cars, and understood that now I was acting again, not merely observing. Control was returning gradually, step by step, through thoroughness and calculation. I knew much still lay ahead, but the first real results strengthened confidence. The strategy works, and the final victory is only a matter of time. When the day of the final court decision came, I sat at the table in my new apartment. All the papers, calculations, copies of claims, and evidence I had collected for months lay before me. I remembered how long it had taken me. Every step was measured, every detail mattered, because I was not going to leave everything as it was. Revenge was not an emotion, it was a duty, a calculated strategy, a measured point of pressure that was meant to return at least part of what had been taken. The trial proceeded calmly, without loud statements, without external theatre. I watched how the faces of my ex-wife and my former friend changed as the first rulings were announced. Their eyes revealed bewilderment, slight tension. They did not expect that everything would be built so carefully, that every detail, every figure, every piece of testimony worked against them. I heard the judge list the items, note violations and errors, declare some deals invalid and order part of the assets returned. The sum was smaller than I had calculated, but it was already a concrete victory, tangible and real. Money returned to my account, part of the property was restored officially, legally, and that meant the strategy had fully worked. I did not feel joy in the usual sense of the word. There was no exultant jubilation, but inside a feeling of cold satisfaction arose. Every step, every night over documents, every action had meaning, and the result had been achieved. I understood that this was only part of what I could have recovered, but the main thing was that the initiative was once again on my side. I remembered those days after the trial when I remained alone in an empty house, when it seemed the world had taken everything from me. Now I watched how they faced the consequences of their own actions, how the mistakes I had uncovered created strain in their new business, how counterparties and partners began to doubt, check documents, clarify deals. I acted calmly, methodically, and that was my revenge, deserved but cold. No one knew all the details of my work. No one saw how much time I had spent analyzing papers, making calls, gathering evidence. My revenge was quiet and precise, and therefore especially effective. Money and property were returned, but the most important thing, I restored control, the sense of power over my own life, and the fact that their betrayal had not gone unanswered. I watched them, pictured their reaction when they learned about the return of part of the assets, and understood that this was what they deserved, because they themselves had taken and betrayed me. I sat at the table, studied the latest documents, checked the account balances, and for the first time in a long time felt an inner harmony, cold and severe but real. I was not going to stop there. The strategy was ready for further actions if necessary, but this victory showed that methodicalness and patience produced results. I understood that restoring everything was impossible, but the most important had returned, part of what belonged to me, the feeling of justice, and the fact that no one could anymore treat me as weak or deceived. Night fell quickly, and I was left alone in the silence of the apartment, watching the city live its life. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in a long while the heavy emptiness did not appear. There was no feeling of loss and helplessness. There was cold confidence, measured and precise, that justice exists, and that everything built on betrayal now bears consequences. I did what I had to do, achieved my goal, and that was enough. The system, the law, my attentiveness and patience, everything worked like clockwork. Inside there was neither anger nor pity nor euphoria, only cold joy that the plan had been executed, and the fact that the long-awaited, deserved revenge had taken place. I understood that I could move on, build a life without illusions, without trust in those who had betrayed, but with a sense of strength, with restored control, and that was the main thing. Money returned, property partly restored, and their confidence had wavered. This was my quiet victory, my point of support, my way of showing that betrayal would not go unanswered. In the evening, I went out into the cold air, and for the first time in a long while, I felt again that I was the master of my life, that the plan, measured, cold, and deserved, had fully worked, and nothing could take that feeling from me. A week after the return of part of the assets passed quietly, but the tension in the air felt almost tangible. I went about my business, made calls, checked accounts and reports, when I received an invitation to a meeting through mutual acquaintances, a small formal gathering that my ex-wife and her friend were supposed to attend. I knew the meeting was inevitable, but felt no agitation, only understood that I would have to look into the eyes of those who had tried to destroy my life. When I entered the hall, they were already seated at the table, and their gazes almost immediately crossed mine. There was no open hostility, no loud accusations, only a barely perceptible tension, hidden in gestures, in a slight change of posture, in the tone of voices during greetings. They tried to control the situation to demonstrate confidence, but I saw every little thing, how they glanced at each other, how they exchanged short looks, how they tried to assess how I had changed, how strong I was now. The conversation began with usual formalities, reports, plans, common questions about acquaintances and affairs. I answered calmly, without unnecessary detail, measuredly, and immediately felt that each of my responses was perceived by them as a signal that control was not on their side. My ex-wife cast sidelong glances, trying to insert a cutting remark into a joke or comment, but I remained unyielding, reacting coldly and calmly, sometimes raising an eyebrow, sometimes simply nodding, making it clear that any attempts to wound me were pointless. The friend leaned in slightly, trying to emphasize his importance, but I noticed that his voice was a little higher than usual, that it carried irritation and slight displeasure at the fact that part of the assets had been returned to me. These little things did not arouse anger, but understanding them brought satisfaction. The strategy had fully worked, and now any attempts at pressure met a measured, cold response. The conversation lasted about an hour, and during that time I observed their reactions, noted weak points, fixed nuances that could be useful in the future. Sometimes my ex-wife tried to move to personal topics, to hint at my past mistakes or that I had failed to recover everything, but I answered evenly, evasively, not allowing emotions to surface, leaving them without grounds for further attacks. I understood that these encounters were not accidental. They were a test, an attempt to assess how much I had changed and how well I could control the situation. In the evening, when everyone had dispersed, I sat by the window, watching the street and recalling every movement, every reaction, every look. I understood that my victory was not final. Part of the assets had been returned, control restored, but the past had left a mark, and new minor clashes were inevitable. And that was right, because the revenge I deserved required attention, observation, and readiness to act again if necessary. I was not going to leave everything as it was. I was not going to simply close my eyes to their attempts at indirect pressure. But now these clashes were my tool. Every hint of theirs, every cutting remark only confirmed that I was stronger than they thought, that the strategy worked, and that patience and precision produced results. I pondered further steps, how to respond to such meetings, how to structure replies, how to keep the situation under control while using each moment to strengthen my own position. It was cold mastery that I had developed for months, analyzing their actions, studying my options and checking legal, financial, and social resources. I understood that such meetings would become regular, but they no longer frightened me. They were an element of the game, part of the process where I set the rules. Every little thing, a look, a pause in speech, a slight barb, was recorded by me, and I used it to build the subsequent strategy. Internally, I remained calm, almost unemotional, but inwardly I registered the sense of control that was now my foundation. Night fell quietly, and I sat alone, analyzing the day's events, noting moments to use in the future, and again felt cold satisfaction. The strategy worked. The minor clashes with my ex-wife and her friend only confirmed that I had restored my influence, that the revenge was deserved, and that now I could calmly build further steps without losing control or yielding to emotions. These meetings became a test of my coldness, and I passed it perfectly, understanding that any new attempts at pressure would be met in exactly the same way, with attention, precision, and cold confidence that completely controls the situation. Several weeks had passed since the last encounters with my ex-wife and her friend, and the world around me seemed familiar, yet different at the same time. I observed how their usual rhythm of life began to falter, how every decision they had made before I recovered part of the assets was now accompanied by doubt and uncertainty. Contractors checked documents multiple times, internal employees started asking questions, partners became more cautious. All of this happened not ceremoniously, not loudly, but quietly, gradually, as if an invisible force was restructuring their familiar world. I sat by the window, watching the street, and every movement of passers-by, every flash of cars seemed part of this new, subtle symmetry, a symmetry I had been building for months. Inside, there was no excitement or triumph, no desire to prove to anyone who was stronger. There was only measured calm, a sense of complete awareness of what I had done and achieved. This unpleasant period of my life, when betrayal had destroyed the familiar world, had made me stronger, teaching me precision, patience, and cold discipline. I was no longer the person who used to react to events with panic or anger. I had become an observer, a builder of my own reality, a person who could see the consequences of actions in advance and use them to his advantage. The memory of losses had not disappeared, but now it had become a tool rather than a burden. I recalled the days when it seemed the whole world was collapsing, when there was no room for logic in my mind, only pain and disappointment. And then I realized that it was precisely that time that was shaping me as a person, that every night spent preparing, analyzing, collecting evidence, every mistake they made and I recorded had become part of my strength. I understood that victory over them was not just about recovering part of the assets, but about regaining control over my own life and inner harmony. The social clashes that arose after the court only confirmed my position. At every meeting, at every event, when they tried to indirectly hurt me through glances, barbs, or attempts to emphasize my inadequacy, I remained cold and attentive. I recorded every nuance, tone of voice, pauses, gestures. It was like a game of chess, where every move must be precise without unnecessary emotion, without risking the loss of initiative. Their attempts at psychological pressure no longer had power. They served only as proof that I had restored control, and that now any actions of the traitors could be anticipated and used to my advantage. I remembered how invincible they once seemed, how their confidence weighed on me, how it seemed that any attempts to regain justice were doomed to fail. Now, observing them, I realized that they were building their own obstacles, and that my cold, methodical strategy had worked completely. Internally, I was calm, yet every cell of my body felt satisfaction, not emotional but measured, intellectual, strategic. This sense of victory required no external acknowledgement. It was inside, like a deep understanding that justice had been restored, that the revenge I deserved had been carried out, and that I had emerged from this trial stronger than ever. My life was now built on my rules. I no longer depended on the actions of others, no longer allowed the past to influence the present. I planned new steps, considered projects, explored opportunities that had previously been unavailable. Every action was precise, conscious, controlled. I knew the value of every detail, every decision, every step. Sometimes I recalled their eyes, their tension when they realized I had returned part of what they had taken, and that my moves were premeditated, cold, and flawless. These memories did not provoke anger, they only confirmed that I had become stronger, that past losses and betrayal had shaped a new me. I was no longer a victim of circumstances. I was the master of my life, a person who could maintain composure and control even in the most difficult situations. In the evenings, going outside, I watched the city, the lamplight, the passers-by, and felt inner freedom. It was a feeling that every step, every thought, and every decision was now under my control. I had won, but this victory was neither loud nor showy. It was deep, strategic, and final. And most importantly, this period, which once seemed like the end, had become the foundation on which my new, strong, confident life was built. I knew that any new challenges I would face with the same cold attention, the same methodical approach, the same inner strength I had gained through all the trials. This ending was not merely the restoration of control, not just a legal victory, but the ultimate affirmation that no betrayal and no circumstances can break a person who has learned to act coldly, rationally, and strategically. I had won, I had become stronger, and now every day was mine, built on experience, endurance, and inner steadfastness that no one could take away.